Hi, I'm Shadow Witch, and welcome to my circle. Tonight we're going to be discussing Ouija boards. And the Ouija board, ooh, I can hear you now. Oh no, not the Ouija board. Well, it is a ghost story, but rather than glossing over it with warnings and dire threats, and we're going to talk about the truth of the Ouija board and where all those rumors and all those scary stories and where they all originated, and what the real truth, the background story, the origin story of the Ouija board really is. This is going to be a two-parter. I'm going to keep them short, under 10 minutes each, but I want you to be able to get the whole story without my rushing through it. So a lot of information here, but I'm going to try to keep it interesting. One of my specialties and what I've been teaching for decades is ancient history, especially as to how it relates to mankind's place on the earth in regards to our spirituality, from Paleolithic times throughout the Bronze Age through medieval times to today. So the history of the Ouija board goes back a little farther than a lot of people realize. Let us start our ghost story in England, Great Britain, with Queen Victoria. Well, we know about the Victorian age. She lived between 1819 and 1901, becoming queen in 1837 until her death. And she married the love of her life, Prince Albert. The thing is, when Queen Victoria became monarch, it's typical for the age of the monarch to start when the monarch ascends the throne. But the Victorian era, known for its morbidity, really took hold after Albert's death. The funerals, the funeral trappings became elaborate proceedings, making jewelry out of loved ones' hair. Ooh, the deceased loved ones became all the rage. Post-mortem photography, sadly, became very popular because photography was just starting to, it had been invented and was starting to become a thing, but many people couldn't afford a photographer, and sadly, many times the very first photograph of a person was after they had passed on, because the family wanted to remember them. So it was a common thing that what happened in Great Britain typically was mirrored across the pond in not only the United States, but also in France and other parts of Europe. For example, when Victoria and her prince brought the Yule tree from Germany, it quickly became the Christmas tree in Great Britain and again in the United States. And everyone wanted to have a Christmas tree in their home. Following Albert's death, the mourning period, the grieving period, which at one time had been a set period of time in many cultures, perhaps a year, maybe a little longer or shorter. With Victoria, she never, I believe, broke her mourning period, as she continued to mourn her beloved forever and ever and ever, wearing blacks, and then eventually allowing others in her court to wear dark purples and mauves, still continuing with the concept of mourning. And Queen Victoria, it is said, brought seances into her castles so she could try to contact her beloved Albert. And it is even said that she discussed state affairs with him and made decisions with his input from the other side. Then the United States. In the 1800s, the religious movement that was really shaking things up was the American Protestant Christians' beliefs were changing during the early 19th century in a period known as the Second Great Awakening. And this period encompassed social justice reform, enthusiastic religious revivals, especially abolitionism and tolerance, abstaining from alcohol, living a sober, upright, very rigid Christian life. And during this time, around the 1840s, modern spiritualism entered the scene. And this was taking place in the 1840s in a small area of upstate New York called the Burned Over District. And quickly, this modern spiritualism grew to become one of the greatest and most divisive religious movements of the 19th century. And it involved mediumship. Many people contacting the dead for their loved ones. The Fox sisters became a viral sensation, what we would consider going viral today. Now, remember the Fox sisters, we're going to get back to them. But to understand the time we were living in, not only was, Queen Victoria mourning her loved ones in Great Britain, but what was happening here in the United States was incredibly sad and tragic, and so many people were suffering loss. We had typhoid, scarlet fever, smallpox, a lot of very serious diseases with very little treatment, no cures. The very smallest of children to the oldest were dying tragically. And then in 1861 to 1865, we suffered the American Civil War. And at that time, 750,000 Americans lost their lives fighting in this war. The sad thing is that many of those bodies never made it home. They were either buried on the battlefield, some of them were lost. Families were never told what happened to their loved ones. Fathers, sons, brothers, uncles, relatives just left and never came home. And there was so much mourning, there was so much grief, there was so much loss. People needed closure. People wanted to connect. Abraham Lincoln, Mary Todd Lincoln, in the White House at this time, were mourning the loss of their two small sons who both died of typhoid fever. Mary Lincoln brought mediums into the Red Room of the White House to conduct seances. And after President Lincoln was assassinated, she continued to hold seances in the Red Room of the White House in a desperate attempt to try to contact her assassinated husband. If only therapy, closure. But at this time, Sigmund Freud was only 5 years old at the beginning of the Civil War in 1861, and he was in the Czech Republic. So enter the mediums. And right now I'm going to stop and start on the second part and finish up how all of this comes together in a fascinating story which culminates with all the scary legend and lore of why people are so scared of such a simple yet fun parlor game called the Ouija board. I'll see you with part 2 in just a minute. This is Shadow Witch, and come back to my circle.